you put up at Austin Variations in May. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it is actually going to be something about that, because that was absolutely jaw-dropping. So please tell us more. I'm just hovering on the participants as we speak to pass on. Yep, I think it's done. So yes, please, and tell us more about that particular premise.
Well, thank you very much. And what a treat that was, Joanna Starnes.
Thank you.
I'm Abigail Reynolds, and yes, I am going to be reading you some from that book that is notorious from the one single excerpt that I posted. I don't generally write angstfests, but though I have written one before, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, The Last Man in the World. Already being asked the title. I'm terrible at titling. When I get close to being done, I ask readers for title suggestions, and that's how I title books. This one has the working title, That Book About Andrew. So I think I won't stick with that. I'm contemplating Darcy Family Secrets, but we'll see. If you haven't read the short excerpt that led to many people throwing virtual rotten vegetables at me, this book starts with a bang. Darcy has returned to Pemberley a day early ahead of the rest of his party. And what he discovers there is that his estranged brother, to whom he's given the Kimpton living in an attempt to heal the breach between them, has come to call on him to tell him that he is now engaged to a Miss Elizabeth Bennet. And so yes, we have an angst fest here. And in the actual book, we then go on to find out how it is that Andrew Darcy has ended up engaged to Elizabeth Bennet. But what I'm going to read you today is actually partway into the story. This is the day after Drew has given Darcy his terrible news that he is married, he's engaged to Elizabeth, and that it is a love match. He loves her. So this is the next day. Darcy has not had a good night. The Bingleys and Georgiana are about to arrive. And to give you a little background on Drew, he was disowned by their father some years earlier. And reasons aren't terribly clear, though they probably had something to do with his politics. He's an ardent abolitionist. So I will start out. I see a question here. Has Fitzwilliam Darcy already met Elizabeth Bennet? Yes. This starts at the same point in Pride and Prejudice, where Elizabeth goes north with the Gardiners. Darcy has met her, proposed to her, been refused. So this is a huge blow to discover that she is now engaged to his brother, who is nowhere near as good a catch as he is. Well, not a bad catch for Elizabeth by any means, nowhere near as good. And this goes a little bit faster than in Pride and Prejudice. For various reasons, I had to move things forward a little bit. So this is July rather than August. So it's only about 3 months after Darcy has proposed to Elizabeth. So what you're going to hear today is Andrew calling on Darcy with Elizabeth. Darcy was not prior to this aware that Elizabeth was in Derbyshire. So we'll start out here, and I'm going to do my best here, but I do handwrite my books and then I dictate them into the computer, which involves dictating punctuation. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to read this without putting any punctuation or new paragraph or open quote in it. If I do, I'm sorry. So here we go. Somehow Darcy managed to go through the motions of welcoming Georgiana, Bingley, and Bingley's sisters to Pemberley, barely suppressing the urge to shout at them to go away, to leave him alone in his misery. Instead, he numbly asked the servants to show them to their rooms and paced the gallery for half an hour, wishing he could be galloping over the countryside instead. Perhaps the wind whistling past his face could bring him reprieve from this pain for a few minutes. Miss Bingley was the first to return downstairs, no doubt hoping to find him alone. But the housekeeper followed his instructions to place servants in whichever room Miss Bingley occupied. She had become increasingly desperate in her pursuit of him of late, and Darcy had no desire to be entrapped by her. If only Elizabeth had agreed to marry him. But the thought of Elizabeth was like glass shards ripping through his skin. Elizabeth and Drew, a punishment from a vindictive God for his sin of pride. But Darcy made polite conversation with Miss Bingley, listening with an effort to her gushing obsequious praise of Pemberley, until Bingley joined them, reporting that the Hursts had elected to rest for a time after their long journey. Georgiana did not reappear for nearly an hour, but that was hardly surprising. Georgiana always found Miss Bingley's attentions overwhelming, and they had been traveling together for days. Georgiana took a seat next to him, a faint air of concern on her brow. "Has something displeased you, brother?" she asked in a low voice. Not for the first time, Darcy wished Georgiana were a little less perceptive. From experience, he knew she would not believe a flat denial. "I did not sleep well, but that is all." He had lain awake for hours, haunted by the specter of Elizabeth in his brother's arms. His sister nodded, seeming to accept his explanation, and began to pour tea for their guests in the teacups his mother had carefully chosen to complement the rose silk on the walls. Had Darcy been able to care about anything, he would have been proud to see her taking on her hostess duties with such aplomb. The butler appeared in the doorway and intoned, "Mr. Andrew Darcy and Miss Bennet." Elizabeth, the sight of her caught him by the throat. That familiar angle at which she held her head, the curve of her neck, her light and pleasing figure that now belonged to his brother. Darcy swallowed bile as he bowed. A crash broke into his consciousness. A shattered teacup leaked tea onto the floor at Georgiana's feet. As she gaped at Andrew, her face bleached of all color. Seemingly oblivious of the spill, she took a few shaky steps forward. "Drew, is that truly you?" She cast herself into his arms and began to cry. "Oh, Georgie," Drew said in a low voice, and there were tears in his eyes as well as he embraced her. Darcy froze at the sight of the tableau before him. Elizabeth, whom he had loved and lost. Georgiana, distraught. Drew, lost to him for so many years. What should he do? Elizabeth's low, melodious voice echoed through him. "Miss Bingley, Mr. Bingley, what an unexpected pleasure it is to see you again. I noticed a lovely rose garden as we drove in that I am longing to explore. Since you are more familiar with Pemberley than I, will you not do me the very great kindness of showing it to me?" Darcy cast her a look of helpless gratitude for rescuing him from the impossible situation. Bingley rose to the occasion. "Ah, rose garden. Yes, yes. What an excellent idea, Miss Bennet. Let us go this instant, Caroline." He hurried them out of the room, leaving Darcy alone with his brother and his sister for the first time in nearly a decade. Georgiana was still sobbing audibly. Darcy forced his feet forward, stepping around the maid who was picking up pieces of broken teacup and saucer, and told her quietly to leave it until later. The maid bobbed a quick curtsy and hurried out. Darcy gestured to the footman to follow her and waited until he closed the door to approach Georgiana and place a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Everyone is gone," he said quietly. "It is just us now." Pulling back a few inches, but still gripping Drew's arms, Georgiana made a visible effort to control herself. "Promise me you will not disappear again. Promise me, Drew." With a slight wobble in his voice, Drew said, "I promise not to disappear if that is what you truly wish. But look at you. You have grown into a beautiful young lady." "No, I have not," Georgiana cried. "I'm a little girl who has been missing her brother for years and years." Darcy said soothingly, "Drew lives in Kimpton now. You can see him at the parsonage there anytime you wish." "In Kimpton?" Georgiana blotted her eyes. Yes, Fitzwilliam gave me the living there in May, said Drew. I hope you will visit me often. Darcy added, I was going to tell you today, Georgiana, but there's been no opportunity. Oh, I'm so glad, said Georgiana. Oh, how I hate our father for chasing you away. But why did you not come back when he died? Drew shrugged helplessly. He had ordered me to stay away from you and never to set foot at Pemberley again. But he is gone and we want you here, Georgiana declared. Feelings were running too high. Darcy quickly poured 3 glasses of wine and gave one to Georgiana. It is true, Drew, and I wish you would feel welcome here. But I also understand the past cannot be erased so easily. He held out a wine glass to Drew. Drew held up his hand. Not for me, I thank you, he said coldly. Now what had he done wrong? Then it struck him. Drew, I freed the slaves in Antigua as soon as father died. Nothing here is purchased with money from the slave trade. The lines of tension under Drew's eyes eased, and he accepted the wine glass. In that case, I thank you for the wine and, more importantly, for the freedom of the slaves. It was the right thing to do, Darcy said. Georgiana added eagerly, when I left school, I joined a ladies' benevolent society where we sewed clothes for freed slaves. Drew's eyes widened in surprise. I am proud of you, Georgie. Georgiana beamed. If I could not see you, I wanted to help your cause. Pray tell me everything you've been doing these last years. There is not much to tell, Drew said cautiously. I worked for Mr. Wilberforce until I went to Oxford, and then I became a curate in Lincolnshire until Fitzwilliam offered me this living. Taking Drew's hand, Georgiana pulled him to sit down next to her. I want to hear every detail. And now we have a scene break. Elizabeth was in a daze as she retraced her steps out of Pemberley, accompanied by Mr. Bingley and his sister. She had prepared herself to face Mr. Darcy's hostility, his haughty anger, or even a direct snub. She had not expected the look of naked pain as he met her eyes, and the shock of discovering the presence of the Bingleys had not helped. Mr. Bingley ushered them from the house, pausing on the portico. Miss Elizabeth, I must say what a delightful surprise this is. I had no expectation in the world of seeing you today. Is your family here as well? She struggled to collect herself. Just my aunt and uncle, who invited me to join them on their tour of Derbyshire. I am equally surprised to see you. I expected only Mr. Darcy today. Is your family in good health? Asked Mr. Bingley. Was he thinking of Jane? If there was any chance of something good coming out of this disaster, Elizabeth would seize it. They are, I thank you. She decided to take pity on him. My youngest sister, Lydia, is visiting a friend in Brighton, but all the others are at home. He brightened visibly. I pray you give them my very best regards. Miss Bingley, having had enough of being ignored, said pointedly, I do not believe I have ever heard of Mr. Andrew Darcy. Elizabeth hesitated. Her first instinct was to avoid the question, but Darcy's look of agony when he had seen her in the doorway gave her pause. If answering Miss Bingley's impertinent inquisitiveness would take the onus of explanation from Mr. Darcy, she would do it for him. He is Mr. Darcy's younger brother. She bit back on the temptation of adding how surprising it was such a dear friend of the family was unaware of his existence. Miss Bingley looked down her nose at Elizabeth and declared haughtily, Mr. Darcy has no brother. I encourage you to take up the question with him, Elizabeth said obligingly. No, he told me once that he had a brother who had been disowned, said Bingley, then looked suddenly stricken. Forgive me, I should not have said that. Poor Mr. Bingley. I am well aware that their father disowned Mr. Andrew Darcy for his political views, and I'm glad he and his brother have reconciled. There, that should save some embarrassing questions later. Miss Bingley's face was white. She must detest Elizabeth's apparent intimacy with the Darcy family secrets. How did you come to make his acquaintance? Elizabeth gave her sweetest smile. We met through a mutual friend. You must know him well to pay a call with him alone. Miss Bingley lofted her nose in the air. An unmarried lady can never be too careful. Oh yes, Miss Bingley's knives were out. And now we have another scene break. Darcy could feel his skin prickling before Elizabeth even reached the drawing room. The sound of her light laugh, a lure he could not resist. She came in with Bingley and his sister, but she was the only one he saw. The others might as well have been ghosts. Drew, damn him, went immediately to stand next to her. Miss Bennet, will you do me the great honor of introducing me to your friends? I would be most happy to, said Elizabeth with the barest glance at Darcy. Miss Bingley, Mr. Bingley, pray permit me to present to your acquaintance Mr. Andrew Darcy, the vicar of Kympton and Mr. Darcy's brother. Andrew, Mr. Bingley holds the lease on a country house not far from my home. That's where I first met your brother. Darcy flushed. It was his obligation to make the introductions, but once again Elizabeth's presence had turned him to stone. If she thought him ungentlemanly before, this would confirm the opinion. Somehow he managed to say, Miss Elizabeth, welcome to Pemberley. May I be permitted the honor of introducing you to my sister, Miss Darcy? Elizabeth avoided his eyes, but curtsied to Georgiana. It is great pleasure, Miss Darcy. Georgiana blushed. I beg of you to forgive my earlier inappropriate display, she said in a small voice. Elizabeth said warmly, my dear Miss Darcy, if you had not shed a tear when you saw your brother for the first time in years, I would think much the less of your familial affection. I am very grateful that Mr. Andrew Darcy has a sister who loves him so much. The girl's eyes welled with tears again, but she blinked them back. You are very kind. Drew said to Georgiana, in addition to regaining a brother, you will also soon have a new sister. Miss Bennet has done me the very great honor of agreeing to become my wife. Georgiana's brows drew together. You are marrying Miss Bennet? She cast a confused look at Darcy. Devil take it, Darcy had forgotten he had hinted to Georgiana of his own hopes, back when he had been certain Elizabeth would accept his proposal. She knew, and he had to stop her from saying anything. Drew came to me last night with the glad news that he had met the companion of his future life, and I am certain you will join me in wishing them both happy. Miss Bingley burst into the frozen tableau. Eliza Bennet, you sly thing, you did not say a word. I cannot begin to tell you how happy I am to learn of this. I could not be prouder and more overjoyed if you were my own sister. Darcy's lip curled. Naturally, Miss Bingley was overjoyed. In a stroke, Elizabeth had been turned from an obstacle to her pursuit of him into a potential ally. Elizabeth seemed taken aback by this effusion of pleasure from Miss Bingley, but she recovered enough to receive Bingley's hearty congratulations. I thank you, but I must warn you it is not yet announced. Mr. Andrew Darcy has only just written to my father for his permission. Still, it is excellent news, exclaimed Bingley. One might almost think it an ordinary announcement of an engagement, were it not for the worried glances Georgiana kept casting in Darcy's direction, and apart from the aching hole where his heart should be. They had scene break. They had stayed over the half hour prescribed for calls when Andrew said stiffly, I thank you for your kind hospitality. It has been a pleasure to meet your guests. Miss Darcy cried, oh, must you leave already? Can you not stay to dine with us? Even knowing Andrew as little as she did, Elizabeth had no doubt he was near his limits. I wish we could, but we are otherwise engaged for tonight, she said. It had only been an informal plan for Andrew to dine with the Gardiners and Elizabeth, but it would do for an excuse. Looking bereft, Miss Darcy asked, tomorrow, perhaps? She looked on the verge of tears again. Had Darcy winced at her words? But he said, we would be delighted to have you join us, and Miss Bennet's aunt and uncle as well, if they are willing. At least he was making an attempt. But if a brief call had been this painful, a long dinner party would be agonizing. I am honored by your invitation, but I cannot speak for my aunt and uncle's plans, and I am at their disposal, Elizabeth said. Where are you staying, Miss Bennet? Darcy's eyes were so intent that she had to look away. At the White Hart in Lambton, she said uncomfortably. He nodded. My sister and I will call there tomorrow to deliver the invitation personally. With your permission, Drew, of course. Of course, said Andrew dryly. Did he resent being left so little choice? Miss Darcy darted forward and kissed Andrew's cheek. Thank you so much for coming today. I cannot tell you how much it means to me. The young clergyman clasped her hands and whispered something in her ear. She smiled tremulously in response. Elizabeth curtsied and bade the party good day. As she left the room on Andrew's arms, she was certain Darcy's eyes were boring holes into her back. Outside, the gig was waiting. Andrew handed her into it without a word before mounting on the other side and picking up the reins, his expression stern and forbidding, as if displeased by the warm welcome he had received. Even if she had felt the inclination to question him, Elizabeth's own disquiet would have prompted her to silence. She could not doubt now that Mr. Darcy's tender sentiments towards her had not abated as she had expected, nor that, by engaging herself to his brother, she had caused him heartache. Learning that she had hurt him was painful enough. Worse, far worse, was the discovery that she herself was no longer indifferent to him. How had that happened? Before coming to Derbyshire, she had lived in the fervent hope of never seeing him again. After hearing his housekeeper's praise of him during her tour of Pemberley, she had felt a certain warming of her regard, but still felt no desire to renew the acquaintance. Why, then, did she suddenly feel a connection to him now, when all hope must be in vain? Somehow she needed to put these thoughts from her mind forever. Mr. Darcy was to be her brother-in-law. She was to marry the near stranger beside her, a man whom she respected, but for whom she felt no particular warmth. Looking at him did not kindle a fire inside her, not like, no, she would not even think it, not now, not ever. She would focus on learning to love Andrew Darcy. Her mouth tasted of ashes. Rotten vegetables, anybody?
Oh, I have to unmute myself. This was fantastic. Thank you very much. It's I can't wait for the finished article. Oh dear, those poor people. And poor Darcy, of course. That's just, I sound just like Miss Bingley here, but poor Darcy, what agonies he must be suffering.
Yes, he is suffering a lot. Darcy in this book, as in general, but perhaps a little bit more so than usual, feels very strongly that his strongest duty that he's learned from his father is to his family, and that he has to do his best to support Drew in every way possible.
On YouTube, we have a lot of comments just wondering what's going on, why she accepted him, and I'm sure everybody's really interested to find out the story behind this.
Yes, well, I'm not going to give that away, but you probably picked up from this that she isn't 100% happy about the engagement. She's not unhappy about it because he's a good match and a decent man, but if his last name hadn't been Darcy, she probably would have been a lot happier about the match. So you will find out about that.
Oh, TC is asking when we are going to find out about that.
I'm guessing late summer is when this will come out. It turned into being a more complicated book than I expected. I don't know why. I thought it was going to be uncomplicated because my last few books have all been very complicated. But I have to say I've learned to really appreciate Joanna's ability to keep going when she's in the middle of writing an Oxfest. I find it hard and have to keep taking breaks. So let's see, other comments. Yes. Oh, this
Kimbell, oh, sorry. Kimbell wants to see a good duel. She says a good duel is a favorite trope. Is there going to be a duel?
No duel in this one, and Andrew does not die at the end. Nobody gets killed. Wickham kind of gets a little close at one point, but nobody dies. I didn't want to take that easy way out there. They're going to have to all face the music. Darcy and Elizabeth do end up together. Andrew even has his own happy ending, which he deserved because he really is a decent guy. I know everyone wants to hate the man Elizabeth is engaged to, but he does not deserve it.
Paige would like to know, as a clergyman, how Drew would take Lydia's scandal.
Drew is not a very judgmental person. Lydia's scandal plays out a little differently in this book. He would disapprove of it, but Drew actually takes Mary under his wing in the course of this book and gives her a little bit less traditional view of religion, what would have been called a more nonconformist view. What were called then evangelicals, which I don't like using the term because it's very different from what modern readers think of when they hear of evangelical Christians. But he has a much more faith-based practice that is less involved with following rules, especially following rules just because of being female. So there's a long segment where he's teasing Mary away from her Fordyce's sermons and into good works instead. So he's a somewhat untraditional clergyman, which is not uncommon in England at the time. There were a lot of very traditional Church of England ministers and a number of nonconformist ones. So.
It's not quite a question, but I just love that comment from Robin Gant a few minutes ago. Those darn Fitzwilliams keep complicating things. Well, don't they just?
Yes. Well, the Fitzwilliams do make a little bit of an appearance in this one, not very much, but one of the conflicts here is that
Oh, I don't know if she meant the Fitzwilliams as the family or just the Fitzwilliam brothers. No, sorry, I lost it completely here. No, ignore me.
Yes. Well, one of the conflicts here is that Lord Matlock makes his money, as many of the aristocracy do by that point, in the slave trade. And therefore, Andrew is very unpopular with him as well. As usual, I don't put my history front and center in my stories. It's in the background, but the question of abolitionism runs through the book. So I talked a little bit about that in my talk last weekend, but you'll see a little bit more of that. Any other questions? I do see a question from Jenna. Why is she marrying Andrew? She only wants to marry for love only. Well, first of all, there are other reasons why people do marry, but it's actually in the movies that it says she will only marry for love. In the book, she does not want to marry without affection, but love is not a requirement according to the book. So I'm going by the book. So.
Oh, there's some reference here to Victoria's question. Let me just scroll back. Oh, do you know what you're going to work on next?
I have an idea. I don't know what's going to come of it. I started writing a book several years ago in which Darcy had an interest in paleontology. And I kind of got stuck on it about 20,000 words in and stopped it because the plot line I had in mind wasn't working out. But I had an idea how I could turn it into a novella. So I'm hoping to do that, a fairly light novella. And then whether it's popular or not, I'm going to be doing another Pride and Prejudice fantasy after that. That's going to be my next big project, and I'm excited about that.
And there's one more question from Vicky Silverman. Will Frederica Fitzwilliam show up? I love her, Vicky says.
She will show up. Not a big role, but she is in this one, being her usual Frederica self.
And the question from Anne Marie, will you ever get back to the Woods Hole Modern World?
I keep thinking about that because I have 2 books in that world that are all but finished. But it's become very difficult in today's political environment. I deliberately, when I wrote those books, separated the Elizabeth and Darcy characters by politics, because when I started writing them in 2002, that was a big gap, but bridgeable. It's hard to write it as bridgeable now. So it's just an issue, and I get stuck every time I pull them out and try and work with them, because it just doesn't fly right now. So.
And maybe one more question from Victoria Kincaid. Was fantasy not popular?
Well, this is an interesting question, because the trope survey that was talked about yesterday did come up with fantasy being unpopular. However, Mr. Darcy's Enchantment has done relatively well, and it's also reached out to a number of readers who aren't Jaff readers and brought some of them into Jaff. So I really enjoy it.
And a question from Agnes, is your potential future fantasy set in the same world as the previous one, or a completely different one?
It's essentially a different one, although it has a number of the same features, simply because if you're writing fantasy in England, traditional English fantasy creatures are going to show up in it, like the Fae and dwarves and things like that. But it's basically a different world within those limitations. So, but I think I'm running late and should be turning over to Elizabeth Adams at this point.
If you